Ethical Dilemmas in Planning is one of a series of educational videos for planners. Presented by the American Institute of Certified Planners, this series focuses on professional development for planners.
Members of the panel, here's the first scenario. Ollie Olmsted works for the Shady Valley Regional Council of Governments. He's working on a regional fair share housing plan. Marty Moses, an experienced and very savvy planner who's worked for the regional planning agency for the last 10 years, heads up the agency's comprehensive planning division and is Ollie's supervisor. He says to Ollie that he just met with the agency director, Gus Van Ness Black. Now, Gus and he want a couple of what he calls expendables put into the draft of this fair share housing plan. These expendables, he says, should be policy recommendations that are plausible and that the agency could certainly live with if adopted. But they should also be the kind of recommendations that would likely be opposed strongly by some opponents of the plan. Gus and I, Marty tells Ollie Olmsted, know that it's going to be very difficult to get the Shady Valley Council of Government Board, which represents all the counties, cities, villages, and towns in the region, to adopt this controversial fair share housing plan. But by putting these expendables, these controversial expendables, to be traded off later on when it comes time for the COG board to vote on the plan, by putting them into the draft plan, we might be able to get the support of some of the COG commissioners who are now in opposition to the plan and get their support for the underlying principle of the plan that every community in the region accept its fair share of the regionally determined need for affordable housing. Ollie, Marty Moses, his supervisor, says to him, I want you to develop a couple of these expendables for insertion into the draft plan. Sumner, what would you say to Ollie Olmsted if you were Marty Moses, his supervisor? Well, let me flip that around. Let me ask you this way. You role play this, Sumner. What would you say if I, Marty Moses, told you that I want you to put those expendables into the plan? What would you say as Ollie Olmsted to me, Marty Moses?
I think my first question would be whether you want this framed in terms of a range of alternatives and whether you want that range of alternatives to be, how wide you want that to be. Because I think planners are asked to do a range of alternatives and there's a framework for discussing that at least. I mean, my initial reaction.
I think for a first go around, Ollie, come up with a range of alternatives. But I want to make sure that they're going to be expendables and that they're going to be things that will draw some of the opponents and say, hey, those things we want out of that plan because they're too controversial. So give me a range of controversial expendables.
Are you asking me to do that based on information we have available, or just trade them out of thin
I want you to do
air?
it because, Ollie, you work for me.
Well,
and I got more important things to do.
I think I have a little problem with that. I'm willing to discuss a range of alternatives, but I think if there's no basis for them, I have a real problem
Oh,
with
there
that.
is a basis for them.
Beside working for you.
They should be, and I said before, if you listen careful to me, Ollie, I said they should be things we can live with and that are really plausible. If they were adopted, we can live with them.
I have less problem if you're sincere about that.
Okay. Does anyone want to take a different position as far as Ollie is concerned? Norm?
I want to support it enthusiastically. I think that's a great idea. As somebody who has prepared a regional fair share housing plan for low-income housing and been shot full of holes in the process, I want something that'll fly. And if you, Marty, want me to insert controversial issues which maybe later on can be dropped to get support and pass the plan, I'm perfectly happy to start with the Regional Planning Agency will override local zoning if you don't pass the plan.
Well, wait a minute. You know, I'm going to role play. I'm Ollie now. Okay. And Marty, Charlie's Marty. And, you know, you told me to do something, drafting some expendables. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that because, in my view, putting expendables into a plan so they can be traded off later on for support for this fair share housing plan, which I'm committed to, I just think is an outright form of deception, and I think it's unethical. Charlie?
I
You're
disagree.
Marty Moses.
I disagree. I don't think we're deceiving here. We're being strategic.
We're being strategic.
That's
Sergio,
correct.
are we being strategic?
I believe so. I believe that you have to have sometimes some items in your plans that will make it possible to get through. And you never know if some of those things that you believe were not possible to get through with the regional authority might make it. And you mentioned that were plausible, though.
Plausible. Do any of my panelists agree with me, Ollie, that I think it's deception? And if we continue to do this and we're found out, it undermines the credibility of us as planners.
I think, Ollie, you're showing your lack of experience.
My lack of experience.
Ollie, I want to use a different word for this. I'd like to call it artistry.
Artistry. Wait a minute now. Billy, is that where you're coming from? Is this artistry? Is this the art of planning?
Well, Marty, I would not... Who are you now?
I'm Ollie. I'm still Ollie.
Ollie, I want you to put in some alternatives that are expendable, but like my colleague here, that are realistic. I don't want you to put in anything crazy, anything that if it was approved, we would be very disturbed about and couldn't implement.
So you would be
Put in-
comfortable with overriding local zoning if they don't conform?
Sure.
Sure.
Sure, I would be comfortable.
Well, anybody with experience, Jerry, would know that the whole report would be expendable. So it'd be very hard to make a distinction what is expendable and what isn't. Tactics in planning is just as acceptable at the local level as it is in Washington. I mean, I think a legislator in Sacramento or Washington would be shocked if there weren't expendables in a major piece of legislation, which this fair housing report is.
Well, listen, I just came back from a talk by the head of the county board who was having some problem with his own planning staff. And he says the role of the planner is essentially to be a technician. This is a kind of, doesn't this kind of transcend the role of a planner as a technician?
That was
Isn't this
1950,
being
Jerry.
too
That
critical? But I mean, that's what planners, that's what we were trained to do in planning school. No?
Well,
Gene?
I was in planning school in 1950, and I agree with you. That was that, but
I
not
see.
today.
I suggest that you...
But what do you do to my county commissioner who told me that that's not what planners are supposed to do? They're supposed to provide good, sound, technical study, analysis, incorporate that into studies, pose alternatives, and let the decision makers decide. Isn't this going too far?
With one caveat, that each of those alternatives should be potentially feasible to be implemented. And if you simply take a technical solution to a problem that has no feasibility of being implemented politically, then you really are not moving the plan forward. And the whole idea, I thought, was to get this plan adopted and to make the difference that you're trying to
Even with the
happen.
intent of doing this, knowing that you want to draw fire towards these throwaways. There could be throwaways, and then because you really want the support for that plan, the principle of every community taking its share of the regionally determined housing need. Jane?
I think you want the range of plausible alternatives, because even though you may think you know what is going to draw fire, in the public debate, perhaps it's something different. And so if they're all equally plausible, the ones that are expendable may be less than what you're thinking at the moment. So you actually may be able to get a better fair share housing plan.
Anybody else want to say anything else about Ollie and Marty's predicament before I move to a second scenario? Norm?
Yeah, I think the underlying issue here is what are the goals of the planning agency? In this case, the goals of the planning agency are to have a fair share housing plan implemented on a regional basis. What's involved in achieving the goals in this case seem to me strategies, which the planners are justified in using in accomplishing their goals. That is to say, strategies have to deal, and we all have strategies, how to overcome or bypass implements toward the goals and objectives that we've stated. And this is what we're talking about, really, goals and strategies in order to implement.
I think that's one of the things you said, the planner's technician. I think we're all saying that also the planner is more than a technician. They have a responsibility to interpret that information and to posit alternatives. And there's an opportunity to be creative, I think, and to challenge people to think about things.
Let me go on. There's another regional planning agency. A few counties away. This one's called Muddy Waters Council of Government. Mary Mumford, the granddaughter of the legendary Lewis Mumford, was recently hired as a principal planner for the Muddy Waters Council of Governments. Just before she was hired, the Muddy Waters COG board voted to approve a $15 million light rail transit plan for the region. There was strong support for this plan, but also some opposition. Mary, who came to the agency with a solid reputation as a transportation planning analyst in her previous jobs, and also is philosophically inclined towards use of more mass transit to solve regional transportation problems, carefully read the technical report that justified the light rail regional transit plan. The report was prepared by the planning firm of Smart and Smart. Mary came to the conclusion after reading this report that there was really something fishy about the projections that were used by Smart and Smart. The projections to estimate the number of passengers who'd use the rail transit system on the one hand, and the projections that were used to project the costs for building and maintaining the rail transit system on the other hand. She was convinced that the planning firm's estimates of the number of passengers who would use the light rail system were much too high, and on the other hand, the firm's estimates of the costs for the system were much too low. She felt that both estimates were based on faulty assumptions, and since a lot of the powers that be wanted this light rail system, given the availability of federal dollars that were there for almost the taking, she reasoned that the smart planning firm probably came up with these estimates to make the proposed rail transit scheme look more attractive so that it would get more support. Mary thought long and hard about what to do. Should she keep quiet about her findings, or should she do something? She decided to speak to her boss, Ben Burnham, the Muddy Valley COG director, and she told him that the proposed rail transit system, in her judgment, was a poor public investment. She cited data to show that inappropriate methods and assumptions were used by the planning consulting firm to derive the high passenger demand and low system cost estimates. Then Mary said to Ben Burnham that she believed that he, as the planning director for this COG, was obligated to tell the truth about that plan to the COG Policy Board. That a mistake was made and that their decision on the light rail transit plan was based on faulty technical work. She went on to say to Ben, the agency director, that's the ethical thing to do. Now let's say I'm Ben Burnham, the COG planning director. Here's what I'd say to Mary Mumford, granddaughter of the legendary Lewis Mumford. Mary, I understand what you're saying, but sometimes planners have to accept and support proposals, even if they have some questionable technical merit, so long as these proposals were approved by the politically appointed policy board that the planners are responsible to, and in this case, that happened. Doris, if you were Mary Mumford, granddaughter of the legendary Lewis Mumford, what would you say to Ben Burnham, a distant relative of Daniel?
I would have a very hard time with this particular issue because, on the one hand, I know how faulty are how questionable are technical studies, and nonetheless they dazzle the public. And so, after I expressed to my boss, to whom I presumably owe some loyalty, my clear findings on this matter, then I would wonder how far I should carry the thing, and at this juncture I haven't made up my mind.
Billy,
Well,
how would you respond?
the public of Muddy Waters is not easily deceived about these issues. And my experience with Muddy Waters is that they recognize that typically in transportation studies, the volume of users are overstated and the costs are understated. They will be asking questions about what happened in Portland, what happened in San Diego, what happened in Atlanta, what happened in Washington. And they are familiar with a lot of these issues. And we have a very sophisticated public who's done a lot of reading. There is no way that you can get away with this. They're not that crazy about the project. It's going by their houses. It's creating certain environmental impacts they're not crazy about. They like their cars.
Christina, you agree?
Well, I believe that the public often is very sophisticated and that they do know about the inflated projections and the deflated costs. On the other hand, I think as an ethical planner that one can't rely on the public to be the ones that will persuade in a public hearing because these big promises of federal dollars, of course, bring out a lot of people who say nothing but think of the jobs that this will create. And I think that if I were Mary Mumford, I would wonder how close a relation Ben really was to the old man. And I would make it my business to pursue this on several other fronts. And those could be things that we all can talk about at some length. But I think that the first place I'd start, and here I can think that I'm a technical planner, would be to start by more realistic projections of my own. So find out, I mean, it could be that the study is wildly biased. It could be that it's biased, but it's still something that's plausible. But I would start working as a planner to get some technical information to back me up so that I'm saying something more than, I don't believe what Smart and Smart say.
Well, I can tell you, as Mary Mumford, that I happened to talk to Betty Bassett, who works for the Smart and Smart planning firm, and Betty told me about a week ago that that firm wasn't really very confident of their forecasts, particularly on the passenger demand stuff. She worked on this study and admitted to me that the estimates were questionable in her mind. I tell you, Marty, I'm sorry. I'll tell you, Ben, Gene, that I think you really ought to go to the COG board and tell them about this. And by the way, if you look at the AICP Code of Ethics, the AICP Code of Ethics says that planners should strive to provide full, clear, and accurate information on planning issues to both citizens and decision makers. And we haven't provided that full, clear, and accurate information in this case. Gene? Or Ben?
Since I've worked for you for the last 15 years, we've dealt with similar kinds of cases. And while I agree that there's a problem with these forecasts, we're not quite sure what the magnitude of the range of the problem is, even if we take the low side forecast versus the high side forecast. Doesn't it make sense when we start looking at the route alternative analysis in terms of public participation that we begin to ask the what if questions if these forecasts are lower than they turn out to be lower, because we know we have some experience in other cities. They turn out to be on the mark, but more significantly, we get a better potential handle on the strength of the public sentiment about moving forward with the system. Because most of the systems cost more and don't have enough patronage anyway. And yet over time, some of the systems are perceived to have a lot of public benefit. We don't know how that's going to turn out here. Can't we put that back in the participatory process and let it be a part of the debate? And that gets then back to where we want to be. The public is as informed as we think we can make them, and it ultimately will end back up at the political arena.
Sounds okay.
Jerry, let me follow up with Gene's comment. I'll tell you, if I were faced with something like this and I was Ben in a COG name that you mentioned.
Muddy waters.
This happens probably be the biggest issue they would have faced in the last decade. And I don't see it so much as an ethical question, although I suspect that it underlies the issue somewhere. I'd see it as somewhat of a survival issue. I wouldn't want to go out publicly with estimates presumably too high in passenger and money and not understand that issue well. I suspect that if Mary came to me, the estimable Mary, came and said those things to me, I would be looking at it, well, how is this going to play publicly? We may have a bias towards wanting this transit system, but we're obviously going to have critics with respect to it, and we better make sure that we can represent this accurately, and we may move to some sort of
Well, wait a
range
minute. I told
representation.
you that the COG board has already approved this thing, and here's Mary coming in after the
Well, what are we
fact.
worried about then? What are we worried? Wait.
Wait.
Tim? I'm sorry, Sergio.
I think from a practical point of view, if I were told that there was something really dramatically wrong with the estimates, I will revisit the issue. I will get my staff behind the whole thing, and I will be willing, if I believe it, to approach the COP members individually and advise them of the possibility of a lack of information so the issue might be revisited. I think I owe it to them, and I owe it to the people, and I owe it to my staff.
Well, I would agree with that, too. Just let me follow up my comment, because I said, what are we worried about? Clearly, if there's information available, it should be brought to the attention of the public. I think the question for the director at that point is, how is this information brought to the attention of the public? Because there are a whole variety of ways that could be done. Some useful, and some very difficult, and some even exploitive.
Charlie.
I would say, Mary, let's make a distinction. And I'd say to her, there's a distinction when you described your predicament to me between making assumptions, which is a political activity. And I would argue to Mary, if she didn't understand what I meant, I won't belabor that here. And then I would say, and then there's issues of errors. How can we tell the difference? Errors occur when we've got a agreed upon convention, a methodology that we use to decide estimates and run the forecast. We make political distinctions when we say what mode, how much, what kinds, for whom, and so forth, that are essentially political choices that we as staff make based on our experience, our knowledge, talking, and so forth. The board has already made judgments about those assumptions by accepting them and doing them. If your problems are with the method that is, we've made a mistake, that is, Smart and Smart has made a mistake with their estimation procedures, they've broken the rules of method, let's go for it. If we simply disagree with the assumptions, forget it. We've already made those choices.
Well, let me put on the hat of Ben here and respond to the initial point. Mary, what makes you so sure that you're right? Maybe your assumptions about the lower passenger demand or the higher costs for the system are also off base. In fact, aren't all forecasts done by planners or inherently iffy, problematic? After all, forecasts are not facts. They are based on assumptions. And planners can sometimes rightfully disagree on methodologies. What makes you convinced that you're right? Why should I buy your assumptions? Norm?
Well, I take it that the Smart and Smart report hasn't laid out the basis for all the assumptions and the methodology.
No, that was in the report, in the technical appendix.
They've laid out all their assumptions, and their assumptions are reasonable assumptions, and
People
the methodology...
like me, Mary, read those things.
And the methodology is accepted methodology.
Well, the assumptions were wrong, but it was laid out. They explained where they arrived at their assumptions, and I, as Mary, who read this report, I'm quibbling about those.
Well, the key issue is, of course, the nature of the assumptions.
Yeah.
And the numbers come out of the nature of the assumptions, and if the assumptions on their face make no sense. For example, if we've got a 90-10 modal split now for automobiles versus transit, and the assumptions are a 50-50 modal split to generate the ridership, then that's a very fundamental kind of an issue which should be brought to the attention of deciding bodies.
Right. And I looked at some of the technical reports, and I'm familiar with them from the other systems, MARTA, and so on, and they just don't go as high on passenger demand or as low on cost estimates. That's why I have some problems with this study, but they laid it out.
I think I would ask for just a side-by-side discussion, given where we're going with this, and in terms of our discussion together here. Maybe I'd like to see what you're saying and what they're saying, and lay it out for me clearly so I can see it. I think I need to make a judgment here as to methodology and assumptions, and if there are inappropriate either methodologies or assumptions that don't fly, I think we have a responsibility.
But in response to my question, my most recent question about the whole problematic nature of forecasting to begin with, we're in the business of forecasting, and they're all based on assumptions, and some of those assumptions are real iffy. We can't predict the future with that much certainty.
But Mary and the Smart and Smart have got to sit down and come up with a very clear description of whether this report erred and why it erred and how much it erred. And if there's a decision made based on that information, then Ben, you have just got to sit down with the head of our board and have breakfast with him the next morning at 6:30 and explain to him what has happened and how it evolved and strategize a way of getting this back to the board and getting this issue cleared up.
Roland Rouse got a job soon after graduating with a master's degree in planning. He got a job with the planning agency of Oldport, which is in the Muddy Waters region. This is a city where Roland grew up. Roland, who's African American, lived all his life before going on to college in the Nicetown neighborhood of the city of Oldport. His parents, who still live in this neighborhood, were poor, as were most of the other people who lived in Nicetown when he was growing up. Recently, Roland found out that the city's neighborhood planning division was preparing a plan for the Nicetown neighborhood. He got a copy of the draft of the neighborhood plan and read it. He became very upset because there was a proposal in it for Fairview College, which sits on the western edge of the Nicetown neighborhood, to expand into about 2.5 blocks of the neighborhood. This would mean clearing about 70 units of low-cost housing inhabited by poor, working-class African Americans. In checking around, he learns that Fairview College needs more land for its growing engineering campus, and that the only direction it can expand is into the Nicetown neighborhood. In the past 5 years, the college has been purchasing most of the land and property on these 2.5 blocks abutting the campus area. The college also has an option on about 400 acres of land in the nearby suburb of Bountiful to build a new campus. The college officials made it known to the Oldport city officials that it's going to build on this land in the suburb if it didn't get the land it needed to expand for its engineering campus in the Nicetown neighborhood. The city obviously wants to keep the college from moving to the suburb of Bountiful. Now, Roland knows that housing at affordable prices is pretty scarce in his old neighborhood. He doesn't want to see these units, or in the city for that matter too, he doesn't want to see these units torn down. After thinking a lot about the issue, he decides to show a copy of the planning agency's draft plan to Sam Seago, the president of the Nicetown Neighborhood Organization, who's an old friend of his family's from long ago. The word gets out that the draft neighborhood plan has been seen by members of the neighborhood organization, and that the neighborhood organization is pretty upset. Bob Bettman, the planning director for Oldport City, suspects that Roland Rouse gave the plan to the Nicetown Neighborhood Organization president. Suppose you, Tim, were the planning director, Bob Bettman, and you call Roland into your office with this suspicion. What do you say to Roland?
Well, I say, Roland, we have procedures for engaging in this planning process, and we've prepared this plan. It's a draft plan, apparently. It's not final. It's premature to be putting it out into the community. It might alarm people unnecessarily. There are lots of options being examined at this point. But hold off. This is not the right thing to do, probably.
But I grew up in this neighborhood, and I really feel for these people.
Sure.
You're going to destroy a lot of old family networks if you clear those blocks. This seems to me just another example of trying to screw the poor again. And by the way, in the Planner's Code of Ethics, there's a provision in there that I learned in planning school, is that planners should strive to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, regardless, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of disadvantaged groups and persons. And they must urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions which oppose such needs.
Yes, and I would embrace that as well, Roland. I agree with that premise, with that ethical standard. But this is a draft plan, and there are many alternatives that we could consider. Am I not speaking? And we could, there's nothing, we don't know, for example, in the plan could incorporate some alternatives to replace the housing. There are
But
any
you know,
number of things
I read that AICP Code of Ethics pretty carefully, and there's another provision that says that we've got to strive as planners to give citizens the opportunity to have a meaningful impact on the development of plans and programs. And that participation should be broad enough to include people who lack influence. Why weren't they involved in this process? Why, even at this draft plan stage, why weren't they involved right from the start? Jane, is that the way you do things?
No, but an institution does have the right to develop their own master plan and to determine in their judgment where their expansion could occur. And it seems to me, Roland, that we haven't finished the internal discussion among staff about whether this is the only alternative, because there's always an opportunity to go up rather than out, and perhaps the university's goals can be achieved without dislocation. And until we finish that discussion internally, it was not right to leak that draft report to the neighborhood group.
Christina.
Well, I think I would say to Roland, I wish you hadn't done this quite the way you did it. I understand the exuberance that made you leak the report to the public, but now it's out. So don't do it again, and we'll have a more serious conversation about not doing it again. But what you have caused now is a situation that we've got to deal with. And my sense, I have a complicated sense about this, is right away one would have a public meeting to talk about it. And that also, this brings up another issue in the scenario, which is that Fairfield College says that their only choices are either to build on these 70 houses or to take the option of suburban land. And as a planning director, when I hear that kind of set of alternatives, I think, well, I don't believe those are the only two alternatives. And so we'll get busy talking to them also. It's an interesting ethical issue, and I think in this one, the young man has acted out of passion for planning. I think he has passionately adopted the one piece of the AICP ethical code. Two. He's adopted two of them and created a problem, which is, frankly speaking, is fairly usual. I mean, leaks like this occur not even with people showing drafts, but talking at a cocktail party about something going on in the Planning Commission. We deal with it every day.
I saw a couple of other hands. Norm and then G.
Yeah, I think Roland was justified. If the city had gone down the road as far as they had to prepare a draft plan without any prior notification or discussion with the affected neighborhoods, I think that's an appalling breach of ethics in itself. And in terms of policy, the neighborhood should be involved from the get-go, and there should be ongoing discussions. And so Roland did the right thing in terms of his goals, which I think are notable goals. You know, if you believe it, as I do, that a lot of the, or most of the activities in which planners are involved are really, or should be, redistributionist kinds of goals, then it seems to make good sense that Roland did the right thing.
Gene,
I take a slightly different tact. I would call Roland in and I say, young man, you done effed up. And I'll tell him why. Now, but the consequences of that are good. But in terms of how this organization runs and how I'm going to survive and how you're going to survive on some other critical issues down the road, you need to understand why you screwed up. But in that screw up, there's an opportunity. And let's figure out how to capitalize on that opportunity. And I
Well,
think
you're in Christina's corner.
but I would also suggest that it's real easy to say, to leak and to do things to say, I don't like that. It's the wrong thing to do. But your assignment now is to develop some alternatives that I can begin to negotiate with this college with and the community.
Okay.
Since you've got it out on the table and that's where you want to be, now let's come up with some solutions to this thing.
Okay, but my friend over here, Norm, said that I was perfectly right in doing this.
Yeah,
You don't
but
think I'm perfectly right, do you?
If Norm and I are willing to pay the consequences, because if,
Well, he's a
if this
professor
is...
now, and so are you, so maybe that's...
Yes, but Roland may be on the ranks of the unemployed, and these are down times.
Well, let's hear from a planning director, currently employed. Sergio.
I don't believe that he's justifying leaking information. I think that...
That he would.
He wouldn't. He's not.
He's not.
He's not
Okay.
justified in leaking information. I believe the proper way for him to handle that approach would be to come to the director and try to work it out. And I think he could have asked the director, listen, I have a serious problem with this. In my own time, I want to go to the hearing and I want to present ideas. But now that the leak is out, okay, and you have to deal with the issue, I think that it presents, again, an opportunity to deal with the issue. And at that point, you have to engage not only him, but everybody else in the community to deal with the issue. And the issue might be painful, but at the end, I do believe that in any relationship, first you have to have truth.
Yeah, but
Doris, Jane, we'll come back to Norm and then Dean. And
There
then
are-
we'll move on to another scenario. Doris.
There are two very difficult issues here, it seems to me. First, what I would call actual insubordination for whatever reason. And it would be very difficult for me to, as a planning director, if my staff was leaking things prematurely. So it would be important, not just for this issue, which I would understand and appreciate, to make it very clear that this is not something that's tolerable, particularly when it's in the negotiation state, and particularly when it deals with something critically important to the city, which is an employment base, and with
Isn't
the
it
threat...
critically important to the city to maintain a supply of affordable housing for
Yes.
people who've lived here for so long?
Yes, and consequently, we're dealing with a conflict. But how do we resolve the conflict? If we care about retaining the institution and retaining the jobs and the secondary consequences for the population that lives at the foot, at the base of that institution, we have got to make some provision in advance for dealing with that. Now, if we have failed to do that, by leaking it prematurely, it almost preempts the possibility of properly dealing with the clear issue that lies ahead in the clear conflict. And so I think it's a great mistake to tolerate that behavior.
Jane, then Norm.
I agree, but having done it, now the question is how to take advantage of the opportunity. But I think there are two sets of processes that have to be undergone. One is with the neighborhood and the other is with the university.
Right.
And perhaps this example gives us an opportunity to set a new policy wherein any institution must deal with its neighbors in its plans for expansion or change, as well as with the city and with the context within which the institution is dealing. And perhaps we can evolve some new policies that are good for the whole city out of this situation which you have created and which should not be tolerated in the future.
I feel like I'm getting whomped and so on. Let me go back to one of my supporters here, Norm's.
Yeah, I think I would like to actually pose a question to Sergio, who seems to be of the opinion that there's no justification ever for leaking. Maybe Doris shares that view. with concern for the institution of planning. The larger question, seems to me, is who's your client? Who's your family? Who's your, what ends, again, do you want to serve? And what if the city is determined to do this? And what if the city is unwilling to change? And what if, in your best judgment, what is going on is terrible planning and terribly unethical? Are you then justified to leak, Sergio?
I don't think that the means justify, I mean, the ends justify the means. And I think that in every particular situation, you have to first be true to yourself. I don't believe that by leaking information, you are accomplishing that. You may be taking shortcuts ethically to get to where you want to go, but at the end, your professionalism, the respect that you have from other people as a professional will be damaged. And other people will know that you're leaking information. The person you leak information to eventually will tell everybody that you leak it. And in the future, you will have problem with credibility. So from a practical point of view, forget about ethics. I think that you don't accomplish anything in the long run for yourself as a professional and for the profession. And for the issue that you might have at hand, you might solve it in that particular case. But in the future, you might be stopped from getting other issues resolved in a proper way because people will not believe you. They will use you because you leak information. They don't believe you.
Dean,
Well,
have you ever leaked?
No. Well,
Obviously.
I don't know what Jay Leno would say to that, but let me say, I think we have two faulty situations here, and I think everyone's touched on that. Jane has too. It's an improper staff act, and that's one kind of situation that I don't think an organization can tolerate. It has to be dealt with some way. I don't think Roland exhausted all his possibilities internally, frankly. I mean, he had other means to deal with that within the organization and within the process that the organization reports to with the jurisdiction. But the other faulty process clearly seems to be, with the skimpy information that we have, is the whole procedure for framing the debate over this issue publicly. And that's been touched on too. I mean, there are probably other alternatives that need to be explored. If it came to, and this is obviously reminiscent and built upon Mayor Daley's decision for the Chicago Circle campus versus a suburban location in the 60s. And the original Daley made the decision to keep that campus in the city. Now the question there is the debate formed clearly, fairly, with the public involved in that process? And from what you've told us, it doesn't sound like it has. So we really have two different situations here that act on one another, but I don't think Roland is excused from what he did. I mean, that is a problem in running a good planning process that can frame the debate clearly and fairly, because what he did is insubordinate to that process.
Because I was insubordinate, you're not going to fire me, are you?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what the situation is.
So
There are
far, no
nuances
one
to
has
that.
said that they're going to fire me on the spot. They don't like what I did.
That's impossible,
Possible
Jerry. You
exception.
know it.
That's right.
Well, but suppose I was Bill, and I was a white planner on the staff, and I never grew up in this neighborhood, but I used to belong to Planners Network and so on, and I did the same thing. Would you treat me differently?
This is not a race issue. This is a question of running an organization fairly and correctly. There are two problems here: the public process of making that decision and what Roland did, not his color.
Tim?
I agree with that. I think Roland's background is certainly relevant to the planning process, and he should have brought that understanding and sensitivity to bear, and I think in the scenario he has not exhausted all of his alternatives, one of which would be to advocate more aggressively within House. And important for me was the stage at which the planning process was, and I took the word draft to mean that the process was still underway of plan formulation.
Yeah, but
If it was fait accompli.
But the
then I
public
would
had
be
not been
supportive.
involved in the
Well, we don't know
preparation
that.
of the draft plan.
Yeah,
But
At
that's
least
part
from
of
the
the process.
information we've got.
That's part of the choices you
That
can
is-
posit. Those are part of the choices you didn't pursue. And the problem is you didn't pursue the options. And if you ran into a stone wall where the director saying, we're not going to go public, we're going to keep this under the wraps, that it's just a different kind of discussion. But there's a lot of alternatives here in working with institutions and neighborhoods to begin that process. And I think this is a good example of once that gets out publicly, that debate gets enjoined very, very quickly, I would suggest.
So there are two other serious problems besides Roland, and I would not fire him, but I would, I would agree with Dean Macris and so on. One is our approach toward the expansion of large institutions. We haven't dealt with it in this day and age when this kind of thing has been going on and become major issues with universities, some of the professors here, and hospitals throughout the country. And we've got to deal with it. And the second one is to draft an entire neighborhood plan without the knowledge and participation of the neighborhood, including the hospitals. Those are two serious problems.
Sergio, then Gene, and we're going to move on to another scenario, the region.
The problem that I see with this also is building on hypotheticals. What if everybody in my staff felt that they have a monopoly of truth and they will be leaking information continuously on everything? I mean, the whole system will collapse too. And so even the sense of order of the agency, the idea of working as a team, the respect for the decision of the department has to be also involved in the decision-making process. And I think that's an ethical issue too.
But the issue that Billy raised, the second issue of having the process be an honest process and involving the residents as well as maybe the college in the early stages, isn't there something wrong with the way you designed the process?
Well, then correct the process.
But it's already been done.
Well, without going
Are
back
you
to the issue
laying
again.
all the blame on me, Roland? Aren't you to be blamed too?
I think probably I made a mistake, and I think that's what I wouldn't fire Rowling. I think from the process I probably learned that there was something wrong about it, and I think that we do learn that in our everyday dealings with projects, but there has to be a respect also for the process.
I want to, in a sense, put myself in Roland's shoes, because if he is the only African American on that staff, or the only or the only female, or the only graduate from the UCLA's Graduate School of Architecture and Planning, then he got a problem, or potentially a real big problem, in the sense that he may indeed have insight and information that would advance the planning process, but the environment in which he works doesn't understand that, doesn't respect that, and won't receive that information. And he may have seen that time and time again. And so now he's got a real choice, a real problem. But he must understand the consequences of making that choice and some potential alternative ways of getting the job done. He might have leaked that information to the only other black elected official and let that person try to take the lead, as opposed to the way he leaked it. If he leaks and makes that decision, then he's got to understand that he has made a conscious choice to potentially either get fired or, worse, his career is shot. He'll be pigeonholed, he'll be offloaded down the hall, and he'll be on the zoning desk for the rest of his life and will never get access to critical information, policy information, and never be a manager or get promoted in that system.
I might get a good recommendation from Norm Krumholtz.
Indeed.
Christina.
Well, I just wanted to say something that's similar to what Gene said. When Sergio said if there were leak after leak within the staff, that would seem to me to indicate that the director was doing an extremely poor job. The other thing I think about leaking is a Saul Alinsky tactic. It's kind of a wonderful tactic every now and then, but there is no town that's small enough that people don't know who leaked. I mean, I think in New Orleans, the best operating assumption is that everybody knows everything.
Nora Nolan.
Jerry, there's a flaw in the scenario, too. I mean, it's hard to conceive.
I instructed everybody
It's
not to criticize.
it's hard to conceive of this institution being at the foot of this neighborhood, in this neighborhood, unaware of that potential. I mean, that is hard to imagine, but let's proceed anyway.
May I, one more thing.
Okay, Dora.
There is about the leak question, I've already stated my views, but about the larger question, the more interesting question to me, is what do you do with an expanding institution that's vital to a community when somebody's ox is getting gored, and that is the neighborhood right there. Whose interest gets represented there? The neighborhood interest, the citywide interest, the region-wide interest? We have those cases all the time.
Okay. Nora Nolan is involved in the technical assistance program for the Shady Valley COG, place where Ollie Olmsted works. One of her jobs is to assist one of the growing towns in the region, let's call it Bedrock, to prepare a land use and growth management plan. Bedrock must decide along which of two alternative corridors it should invest its limited funds for capital improvements. Nora evaluates these alternative growth patterns, and she concludes, based on her analysis, that if Bedrock permits growth along the east corridor, it's going to encourage spillover growth into the adjacent community of Pleasant View. This spillover zone is an area of prime farmland which Pleasant View wants to protect from urban encroachment. While only non-intensive uses are now permitted by adjoining localities like Pleasant View, once Bedrock growth creeps in this direction, Nora is convinced that it's going to create pressures to modify or circumvent these restrictions and to permit higher density uses. In addition to the ag land, the prime ag land that's threatened, this undeveloped area in Pleasant View also serves as a buffer to protect its source of water, a large lake. If development moves towards this area, Pleasant View's water supply might also probably be in jeopardy. Nora believes that Bedrock should encourage development in the west corridor, where the land is more difficult to build on. Although major public improvement costs will be greater for the community of Bedrock, no harm will come to the adjoining communities on the west. So she goes before the Bedrock City Council, chaired by Mayor Rocky Stone, and says that Bedrock has an obligation to minimize harm towards its neighbors in making its own growth management policy. But the Bedrock City Council decides, for cost reasons, to designate the east corridor, where Pleasant View is located, for its future growth zone. I'm Mayor Rocky Stone, and I say to Nora Nolan, look, Bedrock's first and foremost obligation is to its own residents, not to its neighbors. It's less costly for Bedrock to develop towards the east side, towards Pleasant View. And my obligation as mayor, and that's what I'm elected, that's why I was elected, is not to serve Pleasant View citizens, but my obligation is to Bedrock citizens. Sumner?
Well, I'd say, Mr. Mayor, I think if you were mayor of the adjoining city, I think you could see their position, and maybe this is the kind of discussion the COG is set up to deal with, that we need to deal with this discussion or debate maybe at a different level. There's a meeting of the sub-regional council next week, and obviously if the city decides to go in this direction, it's going to have a major impact on the adjacent community. They're going to be very upset. Before we get to that point, which could be threatening politically, maybe we ought to have some sit down with others and have a discussion about what about this region, what do we want this region to be, and maybe find ways that Bedrock can grow in a way that's consistent with your interest in having growth occur, and also perhaps more consistent with the cost of services in either direction.
But I ran on a platform of not raising taxes, and this sounds to me like it's going to raise taxes. Now, yeah, that's a point. Maybe we do have some concern about our neighbors here, but my primary obligation is to Bedrock. That's what the city.
Mr. Mayor, growth has its cost anyway, and so the question who's paying and who's paying for that growth. And I think the question here is, if you're assuming the residents of Bedrock are going to pay for all that growth, maybe there's other ways of looking at this. No matter where it grows, there's cost associated with it. So it's not a question of whether you grow or not. It's a question of how you grow and where you grow. And so maybe the question needs to be restated.
Dean?
Well, I think in this situation, planner has to look, there's the ethical thing and the substantive thing to do right. Then the question is how do I achieve that in an ethical, responsible way? One option available to the planner in the situation that you've described, if I understand it, Jerry, is to talk to the mayor about trying to make a deal with Pleasant View. I mean, if Pleasant View is harmed by making the decision to go to one of the I can't remember, it's the east or west corridor, then why don't we convince the mayor as a planner to go talk to that community and see if they'll share in that expense. If it's important to that community, they also have a responsibility to share an expense, as the other community has a responsibility to cause the least amount of harm to their neighbor. There's got to be some compromise there, and it seems to me the planner is in the perfect position to try to work out the circumstances where the elected officials can negotiate over that kind of a problem. I think that's the issue that first confronts the planner in this kind of situation. Arrange the politicians in a way that a good result can occur. That's the first obligation.
Christina, then Jean.
Well, I agree with that. I think, in fact, I don't find much of an ethical dilemma in this scenario. I mean, I think that Nora could figure out how much, in monetary terms, it affects Pleasantville if they allow the development to go in the west, and that she can arm the mayor, who she can assure is very flattering and charming, not just to the voters in Bedrock, but to mayors of adjoining towns. And armed with some facts and figures, maybe he can go over and say, look, here's how much it's going to cost you if we take the cheaper alternative. Is it worth your while to help us pay for it?
Yeah, but I'm the mayor of Pleasant View, and I'm saying, well, why don't you go over in the West Corridor, and you're going to have your growth? Let it go over there. Why should we have to pay for some of your growth? We want our character to remain as it is.
I would suggest, Mr. Mayor, we have a potential of some hidden cost here that might come back and bite us in the butt. If we get stuck with mitigation costs and litigation that we're going to have to defend ourselves against, that may end up hurting us, and you, particularly at the next election in 3 years, a lot more than the perhaps sitting down and talking with a negotiated strategy up front.
So it is clearly an ethical obligation. There's no disagreement on this panel that communities in a region have ethical obligations to themselves, and their actions have to be done and taken in the context of the impacts on other communities. Then the problem is...
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said here. This is a regional matter, the way it's been stated, and it seems to me the logical forum for some kind of a negotiated discussion would be the regional agency, even rather than one-on-one, the two individual communities involved. But it should be brought up and negotiated out at the regional level, ideally.
Okay. When I first got into this area of ethics, I was a bit at sea, and I once came across a cartoon strip, which I am fond of telling, because it helps to clarify the whole issue, the larger issue of ethics in the gray areas and so on that are involved in it. It's a Peanuts cartoon strip, Charles Schultz's Peanuts characters, and it went something like this. There was Lucy lying in the middle on a beautiful day in an open pasture, and on her left was Charlie Brown, and on her right was Linus. And there were a lot of clouds in the sky. And she said to Linus, lying on her right, she said, "Linus, what do those clouds up there look like to you?" And Linus said, "Well, that cloud over there, that looks a bit like Ecuador, the shape of Ecuador. And the cloud in the middle, that reminds me of the profile of Pericles, the Greek classical statesman. And that big cloud over there, that looks like General Wolfe leading the British against the French at the Battle of Quebec in 1687. And Lucy turns to Linus and she says, "Linus, boy, you have a vivid imagination. I am so impressed with what you saw up there in the clouds." And then she turns to Charlie Brown on her left and she says, "Charlie Brown, what do those clouds up there look like to you?" And Charlie Brown stopped and he scratched his head for 30 seconds or so and he said, "Well, you know, I thought I saw some horsies and duckies, but now I'm not so sure." Well, I think the problem of ethics is that we tend to kind of approach ethics, and particularly in professional ethics, as kind of Charlie Brown ways. There are right answers and wrong answers. My own feeling is that there are right answers and wrong answers, but the journey to discover the right answers and wrong answers take a lot of time and in effect involve some of the creative talents of the Charlie Browns. I thank you for your participation in the first segment of our panel, and now I'd like to open up the discussion, because I know you've been waiting patiently to get at all of us for some of the things that we've said in the last hour.